The notice appeared on the front door of the Caldwell Creek General Store on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and every soul in town had read it twice before noon. Every soul except the one woman it had been written for. Harriet Talmadge had been awake since before the sun crept over the mesa. She had risen in the cramped back room of Me Dunbar's boarding house, splashed cold water on her face from a chipped ceramic basin, and pulled on her worn leather boots with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago not to make noise that might invite commentary. She braided her dark auburn hair without looking in the mirror. She already knew what she would see: a 26-year-old woman with sun-browned skin, sharp green eyes, and a set to her jaw that people in Caldwell Creek, Texas, had been calling trouble since she arrived 18 months ago. She did not need the mirror to remind her of that. She stepped out into the early morning air, which still carried the cold bite of the fading winter, and she walked the length of Main Street with her chin up the way her mother had taught her before her mother died, back in Missouri, back before everything went sideways. She walked past the livery stable, past the barber shop, past the land office with its dusty curtains, and she walked past the general store without looking at the notice pinned to its door. She had other things on her mind. Specifically, she had $40 left in a tobacco tin beneath her mattress, and she needed to stretch that into at least 3 months of room and board while she found work. And finding work in Caldwell Creek had so far proven to be an exercise in learning exactly how small a town's mercy could be. She turned up the lane toward the Jessup Ranch, which sat at the northern edge of town with its sprawling horse corrals and its perpetually broken fence posts. Calvin Jessup was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red face and opinions he shared loudly and without invitation. Harriet had already approached him twice. The first time, he had listened to her pitch with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and then he had said, with the slow deliberateness of a man who wanted to make sure his words landed properly, that he did not hire women for ranch work as a general principle. The second time, 3 weeks later, when she had come with a letter of reference from a horse breeder in Abilene who had known her father, Jessup had looked at the letter and then looked at her and said something worse. He had said he had heard things, and he was not in the habit of ignoring what he heard. She walked to the Jessup Ranch that Tuesday morning because she had a new approach prepared. She had spent 2 evenings working out the argument in her head, the logic of it, the appeal to practicality rather than charity. She was going to tell Calvin Jessup that his 2 stable hands were boys who barely knew a horse's teeth from its tail, and that she had been around horses since she was old enough to walk, and that she could break the 3 Mustangs he had penned in the North Pasture before anyone else in Caldwell Creek could even saddle them. She was going to make it about his profit and not about her need. She never got the chance to deliver the argument. Calvin Jessup was standing at his gate when she came up the road, and he was not alone. Beside him stood his wife, a thin woman named Dorothy who had always looked at Harriet with a complicated expression that mixed sympathy and fear in roughly equal measure. And standing a few feet away, just close enough to hear, was Mabel Trent, the wife of the town's most influential banker, who was in the habit of appearing wherever she might cause the most damage. Harriet saw the 3 of them and knew, from the way Jessup's jaw tightened and Dorothy turned her eyes away, that whatever conversation she had come to have was already over before it began. "Miss Talmadge," Jessup said, not moving from the gate, "I believe I have been plain with you." "You have been plain," Harriet agreed. "I'm hoping to change your mind." "My mind does not need changing," he said, "and I would appreciate it if you stopped coming to my property. I have a reputation to consider." She stood very still in the dust of his front road. The morning light was full and golden and made the whole scene look kinder than it was. She was aware of Mabel Trent watching her with the bright, attentive look of someone waiting for a spectacle. "Mr. Jessup," Harriet said carefully, "I am asking for work, not charity, work. And I am telling you no decent rancher in this county is going to hire you," he said, with the finality of a man who had discussed the matter with other men and reached a consensus. "Not with what is known about you. I am sorry for your situation, but I cannot help you." She turned and walked back down the road without another word, because there were no words left that would serve her. She kept her breathing even and her steps measured, and she did not let her pace change until the gate of the Jessup Ranch was well behind her, and she was back on the main road with the morning sun at her back. Then she stopped walking and stood in the middle of the empty road with the flat Texas scrubland stretching away on either side of her, and she pressed her hands against her thighs and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The hot, specific shame of being publicly dismissed, the exhaustion of fighting the same battle from the same losing position, the deep weariness of being a woman alone in 1878 Texas with no husband, no family, and a past that had followed her across 3 state lines. She breathed through it. Then she counted the 30 seconds out in her head and straightened her spine and started walking again, because that was the only thing left to do. She was nearly back to the center of town when she noticed the small crowd clustered outside the general store. That was unusual enough on a Tuesday morning to slow her step. She watched 3 different people read the notice on the door, watched 2 women lean together and whisper, watched old Pete Calhoun study it with his head tilted sideways as though that would help him parse the words. She climbed the 3 steps to the store's porch and read the notice herself. It was handwritten in a clear, steady script on a piece of good paper, the kind that cost something. It said, "Seeking experienced ranch hand Lockhart land and cattle, 3 miles east on the old Mesa Road. Must know horses. Breaking, training, and care of stock. Also general ranch duties including fence maintenance, feed management, and seasonal cattle work. Fair wages. Permanent position available. All qualified applicants considered." L. Lockhart. She read it twice. Then she looked at the people around her, none of whom were looking at her, though she had the distinct feeling they had all been waiting to see her reaction. Old Pete Calhoun spoke without turning from the notice. "That Lockhart boy posted that last evening," he said conversationally. "Rode in just before sundown and put it up himself." "I don't know the Lockhart spread," Harriet said. "Came up about 2 years ago," Pete said. "Levi Lockhart. He is a young man, maybe 29 or 30, keeps to himself mostly. Has a good operation out there, not the biggest spread in the county, but solid ground and healthy stock. He came down from Kansas, I believe, or somewhere up north. Why has he not hired before? He has had men come and go," Pete said. "Last fellow quit in the winter. He has been running it himself since then." He paused. "All qualified applicants considered," he repeated, quoting the notice carefully as though the words meant something specific. Harriet looked at the notice again. All qualified applicants considered. It was an unusual phrase. Most notices of this kind listed a dozen requirements and ended with something like good character required or references necessary, which in practice meant a filter that would catch any woman before she could even knock on the door. This notice did not say that. It said all qualified applicants. She read it a 3rd time and felt something she had been careful not to feel for a long time, which was hope, because hope was a thing that wore you down faster than failure if you were not careful with it. She went back to Me Dunbar's boarding house and changed into her best shirt, which was a clean blue cotton thing that her friend Clara had given her back in Abilene, and she brushed the dust from her hat, and she went to the livery and hired the stable keeper's old bay gelding for 50 cents she could not really afford, and she rode 3 miles east on the old Mesa Road. The Lockhart Ranch came into view gradually, the way working ranches always did, first the fence line, then the windmill turning slowly in the morning breeze, then the outbuildings, and finally the main house, which was a low, solid structure of stone and wood that looked like it had been built by someone who was planning to stay. The corrals were well kept, the fences straight and recently mended. There were horses in the north pasture, at least a dozen of them, and even from the road she could see that they were quality animals. 3 of them in a separate pen looked recently acquired and unsettled, moving along the fence line with the nervous energy of horses that had not yet decided whether to trust their new surroundings. A man came out of the main barn as she rode up the lane. He was tall, she could see that from 20 yards away, and lean in the way that came from working land rather than from any natural slightness. He had dark hair and a weathered, angular face, and he was wearing a worn canvas work coat over a plain shirt, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately read. She pulled the bay to a stop at the barn door and looked down at him. "Levi Lockhart," she said. "That's me," he said. He was not smiling, but he was not unfriendly. He was simply looking at her with a frank, assessing attention that she found, after a moment, much less uncomfortable than she expected. "My name is Harriet Talmadge," she said. "I am here about the notice." A brief pause. Not a hesitation, she thought, but something more like a settling, as if a thing he had been waiting for had arrived. "Good," he said. "Tie your horse and come down." She dismounted and tied the bay to the post outside the barn, and she followed him inside, where it smelled of hay and leather and horse and all the things that made her feel, despite everything, like she was in a place where she understood the language. "Have you done horse work before?" he asked, not looking at her but picking up a leather halter that he began working at with a piece of oil rag. "Most of my life," she said. "My father had a breeding operation in Missouri until I was 16. After that I spent 4 years in Abilene working for a man named Harlan Gates, who ran 50 head of quarter horses. Before I came to Caldwell Creek, I was at a spread outside of San Angelo for 8 months doing exactly the kind of work your notice describes." "Why did you leave San Angelo?" She looked at the back of his head because he was still working on the halter. "The man who owned the spread died," she said. "His sons did not want me on." "Why not?" It was a direct question, and she respected it enough to give it a direct answer. "They had heard things about me," she said. "Things that were partly true and partly exaggerated, and partly the invention of people who did not like me for reasons unconnected to my work." He turned and looked at her then, and she held his gaze steadily. "What things?" he asked. "In Abilene," she said, "I was engaged to a man named Douglas Farrell. He was a cattle buyer. I broke the engagement when I found out he was already married to a woman in Kansas City. Some people in this part of Texas took that story and turned it into something considerably more colorful than it was. I have been called various things I will not repeat, and those things have preceded me to every ranch in Caldwell Creek, and so I cannot get work." He set the halter down on the workbench and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you ride a horse you do not know?" "Yes. Come outside." She followed him out to the far corral, the one with the 3 unsettled animals she had spotted from the road. They were young horses, probably 3 or 4 years old, Mustang cross by the look of them, with the particular mix of power and uncertainty that made green horses unpredictable. "The brown one," he said. "See what you can do." She looked at the horse. It was a dark chestnut, compact through the chest, with a white blaze and scared eyes. She climbed through the fence rails and stood in the middle of the corral without moving toward the horse, just standing, letting the animal fix its attention on her and decide whether she was a threat. The horse snorted and moved away along the rail. She waited. The horse slowed. She turned her shoulders slightly to the side, reducing her profile, making herself smaller in the animal's perception. She stood like that for what must have been 5 full minutes, and Levi Lockhart stood at the fence and watched without saying a word. The chestnut turned toward her, not walking, just orienting its body. She stepped sideways, not forward, just moving across the horse's field of vision. The horse tracked her. She moved again. The horse followed the movement, and then, almost reluctantly, it walked 3 steps in her direction. She let it come to her, and when it got close enough to stretch its nose toward her, she let it smell her hand without grabbing at it or moving suddenly, and the horse stood there with its nostrils working and its skin trembling slightly with indecision. And then it let out a long, slow breath and dropped its head an inch. She heard a soft sound from the fence line that might have been a breath of a different kind. She spent another 20 minutes with the horse, getting it to accept the touch of her hands along its neck and shoulder. When she finally climbed back through the fence rail, her hat was dusty and her boots were dirty, and she felt, for the first time in months, entirely competent. Levi Lockhart was looking at her with that same unreadable expression. "When can you start?" he said. She almost said immediately, but something made her pause, made her look at him directly and say what needed to be said. "I want to be certain," she said. "I have been told very clearly that no decent rancher in this county would hire me. I need to know that you have considered what that means for your own reputation." He was quiet for a moment, and the wind moved through the mesquite scrub beyond the corral fence, and somewhere a hawk called once from far away. "I know what it means," he said, "and I posted the notice anyway." She felt the sentence land somewhere in her chest. Not because it was grand or sentimental, he had said it plainly, without any apparent attempt to make it sound significant, but because it was followed by nothing. No qualification, no list of conditions or expectations. Just the statement, and then silence, and then him turning back toward the barn because there was more work to do. She started that same morning. He showed her the feed storage and the schedule he kept for the stock, and she took in the information with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been through this orientation many times and knew what to look for. The operation was orderly. Not fancy, but orderly, and the animals were in good health, which told her more about a man than almost anything else could. By mid-afternoon, she had cleaned and reorganized the tack room, which had been functional but not efficient, and she had noted the places along the north fence line where the wire needed tightening, and she had spent another hour with the 3 green horses, advancing the work she had started in the morning. Levi came by the corral around 3 o'clock and leaned on the fence rail and watched her for a while. She was working with the second of the 3 horses, a gray that was more resistant than the chestnut, and she was not in a hurry about it. "You changed the tack room around," he said. "I hope that is all right," she said, not looking away from the horse. The saddles were stacked in a way that was putting stress on the trees, and the bridles were tangled. "It is fine," he said. "I noticed it looked better." A comfortable silence settled. She appreciated that he did not feel compelled to fill it. After a while he said, "The house has a spare room. It is plain, but it is private and it is dry. If you want it, it is part of the wages. Otherwise, I understand if you prefer to stay in town." She considered this. Staying in town meant paying me Dunbar $2 a week. Staying at the ranch meant saving that money and also not having to ride 6 miles round trip every day. "I would prefer to stay here," she said, "if that is an acceptable arrangement." "I would not have offered it otherwise," he said. She moved into the spare room that evening, which was indeed plain: a bed, a washstand, a small window that looked out onto the east pasture, and it was, as he had promised, dry. She set her few things in the drawer of the washstand and hung her second shirt on the peg behind the door and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the fading light over the pasture, and she thought that this was, in some hard-to-define way, the first place she had slept in the last year and a half that did not feel like a temporary shelter against some incoming storm. The work settled into a rhythm over the following days. Harriet was up at first light, sometimes before Levi, and she had already started the morning feeding by the time he appeared from the house. He cooked breakfast for them both, which surprised her. She had expected to fend for herself, and the quiet normalcy of sitting down to eggs and cornbread at the kitchen table each morning, while the sun came up outside the window, felt strange, and then, gradually, familiar. He was not a talker in the way that some men were talkers, filling the air with chatter that was really just a way of making sure they held the floor. He spoke when he had something to say and was comfortable in the absence of words, and she found this was one of the things she liked about him most, though she was careful not to think too specifically about what she liked about him because that was a direction she had decided was not productive. She did her work and he did his, and they crossed paths throughout the day in the natural course of a ranch's business. At the corrals, at the fence line, at the water trough where something always needed attending to. Sometimes he would come and watch her work the horses without comment, and sometimes she would ask him something about the land or the stock, and he would answer without making her feel that the question revealed ignorance. On the fourth day, he came to find her in the late afternoon when she was mending the north fence and said, "There is going to be talk in town." She kept working the fence wire. "There already is talk in town," she said. "There has been talk about me in town since I arrived." "The kind I mean is different," he said. "It is the kind about you living out here." She set down the wire stretcher and looked at him. The evening light made his face look older and younger at the same time, which was a contradictory thing to notice but was nonetheless accurate. "Does that concern you?" she said. "It does not concern me for my own sake," he said carefully. "I am concerned it may make your situation more difficult." "My situation," she said, "was already about as difficult as it gets. I do not think the additional commentary of Mabel Trent and her circle is going to make a material difference." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight change in the set of his mouth, but she caught it. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed and picked up the wire stretcher again. It was on a Saturday, just over 2 weeks after she had arrived, that the situation she had mostly been managing to not think about arrived in the form of 3 riders coming up the lane in the late morning. She was in the corral with the chestnut, who was now accepting a saddle blanket without much complaint, and she saw them coming from a distance. She could tell from their posture and their horses that they were not visiting out of social obligation. Levi came out of the barn and stood in the yard as they rode up. Harriet stayed in the corral but moved to the fence rail to see. The man in front was Calvin Jessup, which did not surprise her. Riding with him were 2 other men she recognized, Tom Braddock, who ran cattle on the south side of the county, and a younger man named Chester Dole, who was Mabel Trent's nephew and generally found employment as her instrument. "Lockhart," Jessup said, pulling up his horse. "Calvin," Levi said. "I am going to speak plainly," Jessup said. "People in this town are talking. You have got a woman of questionable character living on your ranch, and it does not reflect well on anyone in this county who has tried to maintain decent standards." Harriet watched Levi's face. He did not move and his expression did not change significantly, but there was a stillness in him that she had come to recognize, which was the stillness of a man deciding with great precision how he was going to respond. "You have made a long ride to tell me something about my own property," Levi said. "I am telling you as a neighbor," Jessup said. "There are those who think you made a poor decision and who believe you should reconsider." "I appreciate the neighborly concern," Levi said, in a tone that conveyed exactly the opposite. "I hired an experienced hand who does excellent work. I intend to continue employing her." Chester Dole spoke up, which was an impulsive thing for him to do given that he was the youngest and least significant of the 3 men. "There are things known about that woman, Lockhart. Things a man in your position ought to know before he—" "I know what I need to know," Levi said, and his voice was quiet in a way that stopped Chester mid-sentence. "And I would remind you gentlemen that my land runs from that fence line to the creek, and you are currently sitting in the middle of it without an invitation. I am going to invite you to turn your horses around." There was a pause that had some weight to it. Jessup's jaw worked. Tom Braddock looked at the middle distance with an expression of mild discomfort, suggesting he had not entirely wanted to come on this errand but had been persuaded. "You will regret this," Jessup said finally. "I do not expect that I will," Levi said. The 3 men turned their horses and rode back down the lane, and Levi watched them go until they were through the gate, and then he turned and looked at Harriet, who was still standing at the corral fence. She did not know exactly what she was feeling. Something complicated that had gratitude at the center of it but was surrounded by other things, the tired knowledge that this would not be the last of it, and something warmer that she was very deliberately not naming yet. "Thank you," she said. "You did not need my thanks," she added quickly, "but I am giving it anyway." "Those men have been used to speaking first for a long time," he said. "It is a habit worth interrupting." She looked at him for a moment. This tall, quiet man standing in his own yard in the afternoon sun with the flat, honest courage of someone who did not make speeches about his convictions, but simply acted on them. Then she turned back to the chestnut because the horse still needed work and the day still needed doing. That evening at dinner, which was a simple thing, beans and salt pork and the last of the cornbread, the quality of the silence between them had changed slightly. Not uncomfortably. More like a room that had been rearranged. The same furniture, but a different feel. He refilled her coffee cup without being asked and sat back down and said, "My mother ran a ranch in Kansas on her own for 4 years after my father died. She was 23 when he passed. She had 2 boys and 140 head of cattle and about 6 neighbors who thought she should sell up and go back east to her family." Harriet looked across the table at him. "She did not go," he said. "No," Harriet said. "I did not suppose she did. She ran that ranch until my brother and I were old enough to take it over, and then she still ran half of it because she knew it better than we did." He looked at his cup. "She told me once that the worst thing she ever encountered was not the drought or the market falling or the hard winters. It was the specific cruelty of being told, over and over, that she was not suited to the life she had already been living successfully." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the night wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman," Harriet said. "She was," he said. "She died 3 years ago. I bought this land partly because of what she said about Texas. She always thought the land out here had something the Kansas land did not." "Did she tell you what it was?" "Space," he said. "She said there was more space out here for people to be what they actually were, instead of what other people needed them to be." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "I have not found that to be entirely true of Caldwell Creek," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is true of this land." He said it simply, without any particular emphasis, just a statement of fact. Then he picked up his cup and the moment settled, and they went back to the comfortable, ordinary silence of 2 people sharing a kitchen at the end of a long working day. She lay awake for a while that night listening to the sounds of the ranch in the dark, the movement of the horses in the nearby pasture, the creak of the windmill, the distant call of an owl, and she thought about Levi Lockhart with the cautious, deliberate thought of someone who had been badly burned before and was very conscious of the heat. She thought about the way he had looked at her the first day in the corral, that frank and assessing look that had not been an appraisal of her as a woman but a genuine assessment of whether she was capable of the job. She thought about the notice on the store door, "All qualified applicants considered," written in that steady, clear hand. She thought about him standing in his own yard this afternoon, saying simply, "I know what I need to know." She thought, "Be careful, Harriet." And then she thought, "But also be fair." The weeks moved forward. May came in warm and dry, with the kind of blue sky that made the whole Texas landscape look painted, and the work at the Lockhart Ranch settled into something she had not had in years, which was a genuine routine, a daily pattern that felt built rather than improvised. The 3 green horses progressed steadily under her handling. The chestnut, whom she had taken to calling Chester in her head as a small private joke at Chester Dole's expense, was now accepting a rider without much protest. The gray was harder but had begun to trust her, which was more than she could say for half the people in Caldwell Creek. There was a day in the middle of May when they were riding the fence line together, checking for damage after a night of hard wind, and he was riding a big roan gelding named Frank, and she was on a steady brown mare that had become her usual mount, and they were moving through a section of scrubland where the late spring wildflowers had come up suddenly between the mesquite bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and the little yellow things she did not know the name of. And she thought that the scene would look perfectly unremarkable to anyone watching, a ranch hand and a rancher checking fence, but that the internal experience of it was something else entirely. They pulled up at a spot where a section of fence had been knocked sideways, probably by a cow who had decided the grass on the other side was worth investigating. "Same spot as last fall," he said, dismounting. "I can get the wire stretcher from the saddle bag," she said. They fixed the fence together, working efficiently from years of individual experience, passing tools back and forth without fumbling, and at one point their hands overlapped on the same section of wire, and she felt the warmth of his fingers and pulled away a little too quickly, and he did not say anything about it, but she saw his expression shift fractionally in a way she could not quite catalog. "There is something I ought to tell you," he said when they were finishing up the section, "about why I posted that notice." She waited, holding the loose end of the wire. "I had been in town the week before," he said, "for supplies. I was at the counter at the general store when you came in. I do not believe you noticed me. I was at the back near the flour bags." He paused, working a knot in the wire. "I heard you talking to Elmer Briggs about the possibility of getting a reference from him for work at the Hadley Ranch, and I heard what Elmer said." She remembered that morning. She had been told by Elmer, who at least had the grace to look uncomfortable while he said it, that he could not give her a reference that would serve her in this county because too many men had made up their minds, and the Hadley boys were among them, and he was sorry, but it was just the way things were. "I heard that," Levi said, "and I did not like it. And I had been needing help at the ranch for 2 months, and I had not posted anything because I suppose I was not thinking carefully enough about who I might reach." He looked at her. "I posted the notice that evening. I wrote it to be useful to you specifically, though I had not spoken to you. I was not certain you would come." She looked at him for a long moment, with the Texas morning around them and the horses standing patiently and the repaired fence wire catching the light. "You wrote it before I even asked," she said. "Yes," he said. She felt something move in her chest, slow and significant like a door opening. She pressed her lips together and looked away at the middle distance and took a breath. "That was a kind thing to do," she said carefully. "It was a practical thing," he said, but his voice had something different in it. "Levi," she said, and she used his first name without having quite planned to. She had been careful about that, keeping to last names or nothing, keeping the professional boundary clear. It was both things. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I suppose it was." They rode back to the ranch without talking much, but the silence had changed again, deepened into something that was no longer merely comfortable but something more weighted and alive. She spent the next several days being very sensible about everything. She did her work with the same precision and care. She sat at breakfast and dinner and spoke about reasonable topics: the horses, the fence, the coming need to move the cattle to the summer grazing land, the price of hay. She was pleasant and professional, and she admitted to herself in the privacy of the spare room at night, working very hard at it. The thing that undid her sensibleness was a thunderstorm. It came up late on a Wednesday evening, the kind of storm that the spring Texas sky produced with very little warning. A line of black-green cloud moving in from the southwest. The air pressure dropping so suddenly the horses got restless in the pasture an hour before the first lightning. She and Levi both felt the change and spent the early evening hours securing things, bringing the 3 green horses into the barn, checking the roof of the equipment shed, tying down the canvas on the haystacks. The storm hit with full force just after dark, and it was a serious one. Lightning cracked across the sky with the sharp insistence of something that did not want to be ignored, and the thunder rolled through the valley with a physical weight, and the rain came down sideways in sheets that turned the ranch yard into a running stream. They were both in the barn when it truly broke, having just gotten the last of the horses settled. The barn was tight, and the lantern swung on its hook in the gusting drafts that found the gaps in the planking, and the rain hammered on the roof like something urgent. She was checking the latch on the chestnut stall when a crack of lightning hit something close, the big cottonwood at the edge of the yard, she thought from the sound, and the concussion was immediate and physical, and every horse in the barn went wild at once. The chestnut lunged against the stall door, the gray screamed and kicked at the back wall, and the young bay that had just been starting to settle threw itself sideways and cracked its shoulder against the stall post. She and Levi moved at the same time, and for the next 20 minutes everything was pure work calming horses, checking for injuries, talking steadily and calmly into ears and necks while the storm raged outside. The chestnut bit her not hard, a glancing thing from pure panic, not malice, and she bled a little from her forearm and kept working. The gray eventually settled against her chest as she pressed her cheek to the side of the animal's face and talked it down from whatever horse terror lived behind its eyes. When the worst of the noise had passed and all 7 animals in the barn were still scared but manageable, she and Levi ended up standing in the middle of the barn aisle looking at each other, both of them breathing a little hard, both dusty and wrinkled from the work of the last 20 minutes. He saw the blood on her forearm and stepped toward her. "Let me see that," he said. "It is nothing," she said. "He did not mean it." "I know he did not mean it," Levi said, already reaching for her arm with the same matter-of-fact practicality he brought to everything. He held her forearm gently and looked at the mark, which was a shallow scrape, nothing more. His fingers were warm and careful on her wrist. "You need to clean it," he said. "I will," she said, but neither of them moved immediately. They stood in the barn aisle with the rain still pounding on the roof and the lantern swinging, and all the horses blowing and shuffling around them, and she was looking at the side of his face while he looked at her arm, and she thought, "This is where I am. This is the specific place on this earth where I currently am, standing in a warm barn in a storm with this man holding my arm carefully." He looked up and their eyes met, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not a surprise, not exactly, but it was still significant. Like the closing of a circuit, he let go of her arm slowly, carefully, as though he was placing it down somewhere and wanted to make sure it was settled. "We should go in out of the rain when it lets up," he said. "Yes," she said. They sat in the barn and listened to the storm for another hour until it moved east and the rain reduced to a steady drum and then to nothing. And they talked, not about the horses or the fence or the cattle, but about other things, the kind of things that come out in the dark after a storm has made the usual walls feel insufficient. She told him about Missouri and her father's horses and what it had felt like to be a girl who was more comfortable in a barn than a parlor, and how her mother had worried about that in the kind way that mothers worried. He told her about Kansas and his mother and his brother, who was married now with 3 children and still running the family land up north. He told her that he had come to Texas because Kansas had started to feel like a conversation he had already had. She understood that. She told him about Douglas Farrell, the full true version of it, not the edited version she gave to prospective employers. She told him about falling for a man who was good at seeming like one thing while being another, and the specific way that Discovery had felt, not just the betrayal but the accompanying understanding that her own judgment had been wrong, and how much she had worked since then to trust that judgment again. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Was there anything you could have seen that you missed?" She thought about it honestly. "Probably," she said. "There were small things that I explained away because I wanted the explanation. That is not a flaw in your judgment," he said. "That is what happens when somebody lies well." She was quiet for a moment. "You are very reasonable," she said. "I am told that is occasionally a fault," he said, and the slight dryness in it made her laugh, a small genuine sound that felt very natural in the quiet barn. The weeks that followed had a different texture to them. Not dramatically different, the work was the same, the days were the same shape, but there was a warmth to the daily interactions that had not been there before, or rather, had been there, but was now acknowledged between them in some unspoken way. He would bring her a cup of coffee to the corral without being asked, and she would receive it without making an event of it. She would find that he had already done the piece of work she had been planning for the morning, and she would adjust her plans without comment, and they moved through the ranch's demands with the unconscious choreography of 2 people who had begun to genuinely know each other. In June, she needed to go into town for supplies and she asked if he needed anything, and he said, as a matter of practicality, that it would be useful if she rode in with him so they could load more at once. They rode together down the old Mesa Road, and the townspeople of Caldwell Creek observed them with a range of expressions from politely neutral to openly hostile. And Harriet walked through it all with her chin at the same angle. She had been carrying it for the last 18 months. And Levi walked beside her with no apparent interest in anyone else's feelings about it. They stopped at the general store, and Pete Calhoun was on the porch and greeted them both with equal warmth, which Harriet noted with appreciation. Inside the store, she was filling a list and she turned around and nearly walked directly into Mabel Trent, who had the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity. "Miss Talmadge," Mabel said. "Mrs. Trent," Harriet said. "I hope you are not imposing on the generosity of a good man," Mabel said, in the pleasant tone of someone who had made an art form of delivering poison with sweetness. Before Harriet could respond, Levi appeared at her shoulder. She had not heard him come up behind her and said, equally pleasantly, "Mrs. Trent, I can assure you that the imposing runs entirely in the other direction. Miss Talmadge has done more work in 2 months than my last 3 hands did in a year. I am the fortunate one." He picked up the flour sack from the counter and nodded at Mabel with the polite finality of someone who has completed the conversation, and walked toward the door. Harriet met Mabel's eyes for a brief moment and then followed him out. On the road home, with the supply load packed into the saddle bags and both horses moving easily in the afternoon heat, she said, "You did not need to do that." "I know," he said, "but thank you. You are more than capable of handling that woman yourself," he said. "I just happened to be standing there with an opinion." She glanced at him sideways. "You are not in the habit of stating opinions spontaneously," she observed. "I am in the habit of stating opinions when they are accurate and pertinent," he said. They rode in silence for a while, and the road stretched ahead of them through the scrubland, and the late afternoon light came golden through the mesquite, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, which was simply good. The simple physical fact of feeling good, sitting on a reliable horse on a Texas afternoon, next to a man who had just publicly, and without fanfare, told a roomful of people that she was worth something. She did not say anything else about it, and neither did he. But when they arrived back at the ranch and began unloading the supplies, she caught him looking at her once, just once, briefly, with an expression she had no trouble reading at all. The summer deepened. The work with the 3 green horses reached the stage where they were reliable enough to use for regular ranch work, which meant the training had been successful enough to justify bringing in more stock. Levi asked her opinion about acquiring 2 additional horses from a dealer in Abilene, and she gave it fully and without hedging, and he listened and asked follow-up questions and made the decision based partly on what she said, and this was, she thought, one of the more extraordinary things about working for him. He actually listened. She had begun to keep a small notebook in which she tracked the horses' progress, feeding schedules, behavioral notes, training milestones. He found it one morning on the kitchen table and looked through it with evident interest and then looked at her and said, "You should have been A," and then paused, and she raised an eyebrow and he said, "I was going to say a trainer at a proper breeding operation, but I suppose you would not have needed to be anything other than what you are." "And what am I?" she said, because she wanted to hear how he would answer. He looked at her steadily. "The best hand I have had on this ranch," he said. "The best one I expect to have." She held his gaze for a moment too long and then looked back at her coffee cup. "That is kind of you to say," she said. "It is accurate," he said. "I'm not in the habit of saying things that are not accurate." She knew that. It was one of the things she had come to rely on about him, that specific honesty, not the blunt kind that used truth as a weapon, but the quieter kind that used it as a building material. July came in hot and still, and they moved the cattle to the summer grazing land, which required 2 full days of riding that covered most of the northern section of the property. They camped one night in the open. It was a practical necessity, the distance being too great for a single day, and she was perfectly comfortable with the arrangement, and so was he, and they sat by the fire after the cattle were settled and watched the enormous Texas sky do its evening transformation from amber to deep rose to the absolute dark blue that preceded full night. "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. She thought about it. "I miss the way it smelled in the spring," she said. "Everything was wetter there. Greener, but I do not miss the feeling of it." She paused. "I think home is less about the geography than people claim." "What is it about then?" he said. Looked at the fire for a moment. "I think it is about whether you are allowed to be yourself in a place," she said. "Whether the place and the people in it have room for the particular kind of person you are." He was quiet for a while, and the fire crackled and a coyote called once from somewhere in the dark hills. "Do you feel that here?" he said. "On this land?" She thought about her answer with care, because he deserved a careful answer. "I feel it here more than I have felt it anywhere in years," she said. He turned and looked at her across the fire, and she looked back, and the night was very large and quiet around them, and the stars were extraordinary, the kind of stars that were only visible from places sufficiently far from town, and she thought, "Here is this man, and here is this land, and here is this specific night, and I am done pretending that I do not know what I feel." She did not say that. Not yet. She looked at the stars, and he looked at the stars, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had reached the same conclusion from different directions, and were taking their time about acknowledging it. It was August when he said something. They had spent the morning working a section of pasture and come back to the ranch house in the early afternoon, and she was washing her hands at the pump and he was standing nearby, and he said, without any preamble, "I have been thinking about something and I want to say it plainly, because I do not know another way." She dried her hands on the towel that hung from the pump post and looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual posture. He was usually entirely comfortable in his body and in space, and the slight awkwardness of it made her heart do something quick and involuntary. "I did not post that notice only because I needed a hand," he said. "That was part of it, and the work you have done has been everything I needed and more. But I heard you in that store talking to Elmer Briggs, and he stopped, tried again. I did not like what I heard, not just the injustice of it, though I did not like that either. I did not like the idea of you leaving. I had not spoken to you. I did not know you, but I heard you speak, and I saw the way you held yourself while someone told you no again, and he looked at his hat. I wanted you to stay." She let the silence after those words sit for a moment, because they deserved to sit. "Levi," she said, and her voice was very steady because she was putting everything she had into keeping it that way. "Look at me." He looked at her. "I came here expecting work," she said, "and you gave me the best work I have had in years, and somewhere in the middle of all of it you gave me something else, and I want you to know that I see it. The notice. The morning you stood in this yard and told those men to turn their horses around. The way you hear me when I speak. The way this place feels when I am in it." She took a breath. "I did not come here expecting that. I was not looking for it, but here we are." "Here we are," he said quietly. She stepped toward him and reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for just a moment, the way a person did when they received something they had been wanting carefully, and then he put his hand over hers and turned his face slightly into her palm. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would consider." She smiled genuinely, fully, without reserve, the first time she had smiled like that in longer than she could precisely remember. "Levi Lockhart," she said, "you posted a job notice for me before I even asked. I think courting me properly is the very least of what you are capable of." He laughed, a real laugh, not the half-suppressed one she had been occasionally catching glimpses of for months, but a full, open sound, and it was one of the best sounds she had heard in recent memory. They stood in the ranch yard with the August sun overhead, and the horses moving in the pasture and the windmill turning in the dry summer breeze, and he held her hand and looked at her with the uncomplicated honesty that was the most essential thing about him. "I think," he said, "that I have been in some degree of trouble since the day you walked into that corral." "Only some degree," she said. "A very significant degree," he amended. She laughed too, and it rose up out of her clear and light, and the horses in the near pasture lifted their heads at the sound. The courtship was exactly what he had promised proper, which in the context of 1878 Texas meant that he was deliberate and thoughtful about it, and treated her with the specific seriousness of a man who intended what he was saying, which was the only kind of seriousness she was interested in. He rode with her along the fence lines, and they talked for hours about everything they had been saving up without knowing they were saving it. He brought her things that were neither showy nor arbitrary. A book he thought she would like, a pair of good leather work gloves to replace the worn-through ones she had been making do with, a small bunch of wildflowers picked from the section of pasture they had ridden through together on the day he told her about his mother. She returned his attentions in the ways available to her. She cooked dinner on Friday evenings with the genuine effort of someone cooking for another person rather than just for herself, and she taught him a trick for the gray horse that she had not shared before, a specific hand signal the animal had learned to respond to. And she brought him coffee in the late afternoon when he was doing accounts at the kitchen table, and sat with him while the light changed outside, and they talked about nothing in particular and everything in general. September came in with a cool, clean edge, the first hint of the fall that would eventually follow, and with it came a development she had not entirely anticipated. Word from Calvin Jessup. Not from Jessup himself. The man had too much pride for that, but from his wife Dorothy, who appeared one morning at the Lockhart gate while Harriet was working the gray in the corral. Harriet saw her from across the yard and felt a brief wariness but went to meet her. Dorothy Jessup was a kind woman underneath the constraints of her circumstances, and Harriet had known that even when the woman had been standing silent at her husband's side, while he said things he should not have said. "Miss Talmadge," Dorothy said. She was holding a folded letter. "I have come with something I should have brought sooner." Harriet waited. "My husband has had a change of thought," Dorothy said carefully. "He would not come himself, and I am not going to make you wait for him to find the courage for it. He knows he was wrong about what he said to you, not just the last time but the time before as well. What he said about your reputation." She pressed her lips together. "He heard it from Tom Braddock's wife, who heard it from Mabel Trent, and he repeated it without questioning it, which is its own kind of wrong. He knows that now." Harriet looked at this woman who had come alone on horseback to deliver an apology that was not hers to give but that she had clearly felt responsible for providing anyway. "Thank you, Mrs. Jessup," she said. "That means something." "The letter is from my husband," Dorothy said, handing it over. "He will not say it to your face, not yet, but it is in writing, which is something." She paused. "You have done well out here, Miss Talmadge. People are taking note of that whether they say so or not." She rode back down the lane, and Harriet stood at the gate with the letter in her hand and thought about the strange, slow ways in which things changed. Not quickly, not completely, but they changed. She showed the letter to Levi that evening. He read it without comment, then set it on the table and looked at her. "He is admitting he repeated things he did not verify," Levi said. "Yes, and that he was wrong to refuse you work on that basis." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "It does not undo what it cost you," he said, "but it is a start." "It is," she said, "and I am not looking backward right now." He looked at her across the table with that steady warmth that had become the constant condition of his face when he looked at her. "No," he said, "neither am I." October arrived, and with it came a day that she had not been planning for but found herself stepping into with perfect readiness. They had ridden out to the far eastern section of the property, the highest ground on the ranch, a ridge that looked out over the whole sweep of the valley. It was one of those October days that Texas sometimes produced as a kind of gift, cool and clear with a sky so intensely blue it almost hurt, and the fall colors on the scrub oaks at the ridge's edge were turning amber and rust, and the whole valley below them was golden in the afternoon light. They dismounted and stood at the ridge looking out, and she put her hand in his arm because the view invited it, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood together with the whole country laid out below them like something offered. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. not with the look that meant he was working up to something difficult, but with the look that meant he had already decided and was simply delivering the conclusion. "I would like you to stay," he said, "not as a hand, as my wife, as the person this land belongs to as much as it does to me, because I cannot honestly imagine it without you in it anymore." She looked at him with the morning, no, the afternoon sun on his face and the honest earnestness of him. This man who had put a notice on a door before she had even asked, who had stood in his own yard and turned away men who came to tell him who she was, who had listened to her in barns and around fires and at kitchen tables and had heard her, actually heard her, and had never once asked her to be different than she was. She said yes, without any hesitation, because there was no hesitation to have. He smiled, and it was the full, genuine version of it that she had been collecting glimpses of all summer, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her with the particular tenderness of a man who had been careful for a long time and was now allowing himself to stop being careful. And she kissed him back with the full and uncomplicated force of someone who had finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere she intended to stay. They stood on the ridge in the October afternoon, with the valley below them and the horses waiting patiently behind. And the world was very large and very beautiful and entirely without reservation. They were married in November in the small church at the edge of Caldwell Creek, in a ceremony performed by the Reverend Haas, who was a practical man and asked no unnecessary questions. Pete Calhoun was there, and Mee Dunbar from the boarding house, and Dorothy Jessup came without her husband, which was its own kind of statement and was received as such. A few of the neighboring families attended, including a couple named Whitfield who ran cattle to the south and had been quietly friendly to Harriet since she arrived in the county. She wore a dress that Mee Dunbar had helped her make from good blue wool, and she carried the last of the fall wildflowers that she had found on the eastern ridge that morning, and she stood at the front of the church and watched Levi walk toward her with the long, measured step of a man who knew where he was going, and she felt completely, unambiguously certain. Calvin Jessup was not there. Tom Braddock was not there. Mabel Trent was conspicuously not there, which was to say that her absence was itself a kind of presence, a crackling disapproval that made itself felt even from across town. Harriet noticed this and found, to her own interest, that it troubled her not at all. The people who mattered were here. Harriet Talmadge, Reverend Haas said at the appropriate moment, and she thought about the name she was about to exchange it for and felt a complicated, specific warmth. Harriet Lockhart, she thought. Yes. The winter settled over the Lockhart ranch with the benign weight of a season that was, for once, not adversarial. The house was warm, heated by the good stone fireplace that Levi had built the second year he was there, and the horses were housed safely in the barn, and the cattle were in the sheltered valley pasture that was the least exposed section of the land. She and Levi had spent the fall making preparations for winter with the happy industry of two people who were doing it together for the first time, and found that they were very good at it. The evenings were long, and they spent them in the way that people spent long winter evenings in 1878, reading aloud to each other from the small but good collection of books that Levi kept on the shelf beside the fireplace, playing cards, talking about the land and the plans they were making for the spring, talking about things further off, the horses they wanted to acquire, the section of the East Ridge that Levi thought would be good for additional pasture if they put in the right fencing, the possibility of starting a training service for the neighboring ranches, since Harriet's work with the green horses had gotten around in the way that good work eventually did. In February, she confirmed what she had suspected since January, which was that she was carrying their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which was oddly fitting given that Tuesday mornings had played a particular role in the story of them. She said it plainly, the way he would have said it, and watched the expression move across his face, surprise, and then something that was so openly, completely joyful that she felt her eyes sting with it. He stood up from the table and took her hands and held them and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, and then said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am strong and I intend to stay working as long as I can, which will be most of the spring." "Of course," he said, because he was not the kind of man who would say otherwise. "Levi," she said, "yes. You look as though someone told you the best news in the world." "Yes," he said, "that is accurate." She laughed and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against the worn flannel of his shirt and felt the steadiness of him all around her, the specific warmth of a person who was both a choice and a certainty. And she thought, "I walked into that corral to prove something to a man I had not met, and I ended up with all of this." She thought her mother would have found the whole story very satisfying. Spring returned to the Lockhart ranch with the full force of a Texas March, gusty and unpredictable and eventually beautiful. The horses were back in the paddock, and the world was greening, and she was working lighter duties now, but still working. Still the primary trainer for the 3 new horses they had brought in from an Abilene dealer in late February. And people from neighboring ranches had started sending animals out for her to work with, which meant that the training service was becoming a reality rather than just a plan. A man named Robertson from the county's eastern edge rode out with a difficult horse, a big black that had thrown 2 riders and was considered dangerous. And she spent 3 days with it before anyone, including Robertson, would have believed what she achieved. And when Robertson collected his horse and paid the fee, he said, with the slightly dazed air of a man who had revised a significant assumption, "I did not know if that is to say I had heard well. I had heard wrong." "People often do," she said pleasantly, and collected his payment. She mentioned it to Levi that evening, and he said, "Robertson is a decent man underneath the conventional thinking. He will tell people." "He will," she agreed. "Whether that changes anything broadly is another matter. It changes it one person at a time," he said. "That is how it generally works." She looked at him. "Your mother told you that, probably," he said. "She told me a lot of things. I should have been taking better notes." She smiled at him across the dinner table with the spring evening coming in through the window, and the sound of the horses outside and the comfortable weight of the child she was carrying. And she thought that she had in fact been taking excellent notes all along, just not in any book. She had been collecting them in the part of herself that knew what mattered, and the collection was very good. Their son was born in late September of 1879, a healthy boy they named James, after Levi's father. He came into the world on a clear autumn morning with the easy vigor of someone who had decided he was ready and saw no reason to delay. And Harriet held him in the bedroom of the ranch house with Levi sitting beside her, and the early morning light coming gold through the east window, and the whole ranch breathing quietly outside. And she thought that she had built a full and real life in the space of a year and a half, and she was not done building it. James was a solid, good-natured baby who slept adequately and was fascinated by horses from the moment he could focus his eyes. She continued her training work through the fall with the practicality of a woman who had earned the life she was living and did not intend to retreat from it. And Levi took on more of the morning chores without comment and without making her feel that she owed him something for it, because that was how he understood the way things worked between them. The following spring, Calvin Jessup appeared at the Lockhart gate for the first time. He came alone, and he sat on his horse for a moment outside the gate before Harriet saw him from the corral and walked over. He was older looking than she remembered, and his red face had some chagrin in it that she suspected had taken considerable effort to arrange. Mrs. Lockhart," he said, with the awkwardness of a man attempting a correction he had not practiced enough. "Mr. Jessup," she said, "I have a horse that my Dorothy thinks you might be able to help with," he said. "A young mare, 3 years. She is not mean, but she is nervous, and nobody has been able to settle her." Harriet looked at him steadily. She thought about the road outside his gate 18 months ago, and the words he had used, "No decent rancher in this county will hire you," and she thought about all the mornings that had followed that particular morning, and where she had arrived from them. "Bring her by on Thursday," she said. "I will look at her." He nodded, and something in his face shifted that she chose to understand as the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get from a man of his particular formation. "Thursday, then," he said. "Thank you." He rode away down the lane, and she stood at the gate watching him go, and Levi came up beside her a moment later and stood there with her. "Was that Jessup?" he said. "He has a horse," she said. "Ah," Levi said. "I told him Thursday." "Good," he said, and there was no triumph in his voice, just the satisfaction of a practical man who was pleased that something that should happen was going to happen. She turned and looked at him, this husband of hers, this man who had written her into a future before she had known to ask for one, and she said, "You knew he would come eventually." "I thought it was likely," he said. "People who are mostly decent eventually find their way to the right thing. It just takes them longer than it should." She laughed, and the sound went out across the spring morning, and in the near pasture James was asleep in the carrying basket she had set in the shade of the fence post, and the horses were moving along the far fence in the way they always did in the morning, and the whole ranch was alive and working and hers, entirely and without qualification hers. She thought about the notice on the store door. "All qualified applicants considered." Written by a man she had not yet met, about a job she had not yet asked for, in a hand so steady it looked like certainty. She thought about walking through the Lockhart gate for the first time on a borrowed horse, and the man who had come out of the barn and said good, in the way that good meant he had been waiting. She thought about all the versions of no she had been given before she arrived here, the polite ones and the unkind ones, and the one on the road outside Jessup's gate that had been delivered in front of an audience. And she thought about how none of them had been the true final word on what was possible for her. The true final word had been written in clear, steady ink on a piece of good paper and pinned to the door of a general store on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, by a man who had not yet spoken to her but had already decided she was worth making room for. In the end, that was the whole of it. Someone making room, not out of pity, not out of philosophy. Out of the simple, concrete act of a person who looked at a situation that was unjust and posted a notice to address it before the person most affected could even find the words to ask. She was 28 years old, and she had a husband who heard her when she spoke, and a son who was already pulling himself upright at the corral fence to watch the horses and land that she knew by heart and work that was entirely her own. And she had arrived here by the particular and improbable route of a town that told her no decent rancher would have her and one man who decided, quietly and without making a ceremony of it, that he disagreed. The April after James took his first steps, she and Levi rode out to the eastern ridge on a Sunday afternoon, the way they had made a habit of doing when the season allowed. The valley was green below them, the most vivid green that Texas spring produced before the summer dried it back to gold, and the sky was that deep, particular blue, and the whole country was laid out below them like something that had always been waiting to be seen from exactly this angle. She was carrying their second child, had been for 4 months, though she had not announced it beyond the two of them and me Dunbar, who had become a kind of aunt to the whole arrangement and who had already begun knitting something small and yellow. "What do you think for a name?" she said, looking out at the valley. He thought about it. "If it is a boy," he said, "perhaps something from your side." She turned and looked at him. Her father had been named Thomas. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Lockhart," he said. "That sounds solid. And if it is a girl—" He looked at her with the warmth that had never once in 2 years of their life together become something she could take for granted, because it was always specific, always for her, always the same look that she had first caught across a corral fence when she climbed back through the rails with dust on her hat. "Clara," she said before he could answer, thinking of her friend in Abilene who had given her the blue shirt she had worn on the best day of her working life. "Clara Lockhart. Clara Lockhart," he said. "Yes." Below them, the valley moved in the April wind, the whole green sweep of it, and the Lockhart horses were visible in the far pasture, small and dark, and moving with the easy certainty of animals that knew where they were. She leaned her shoulder against his and he put his arm around her, and they stood together on the ridge in the afternoon, and there was nothing left unresolved, not in the broad sweep of things or in the small particular things that mattered most, and the story of them was far from over, but it was completely, thoroughly begun, and it was good all the way down to the ground it stood on. They rode home in the long golden light of the April evening, and the ranch came into view the way it always did. The windmill first, then the outbuildings, then the house, and she felt the same thing she felt every time she came up the lane from any direction, which was the simple, specific sensation of a place that was genuinely hers. Not borrowed, not temporary. Hers and his, and belonging to the life they had made together from the materials of a notice on a door, and a corral fence, and a barn in a storm, and all the breakfasts, and all the fence lines, and all the honest words spoken over kitchen table candlelight in the long evenings of a Texas winter. Levi opened the gate and she rode through, and he followed and he latched it behind him, and above them the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and inside the house James was awake and waiting in Me Dunbar's capable arms. And tomorrow the horses would need tending and the fence line would need checking, and the work of the land would ask everything of them, and they would give it freely, because this was the life they had chosen, each of them, clearly and without reservation. She dismounted and handed him her reins, and he took them with the warm, familiar ease of a person who knew exactly what he was holding, and she walked up the porch steps and pushed open the door of the house that was home. And behind her she heard him talking softly to the horses the way he sometimes did, the way she sometimes did herself in the early morning when the ranch was quiet and the light was just beginning, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment and listened to the sound of it. His voice and the horses moving and the windmill turning and the whole ranch settling into evening, and she thought, this is it. This is exactly the thing, the full particular specific thing. She stepped inside into the warmth and the lamplight and the smell of supper and the happy noise of her son recognizing her across the room, and she closed the door gently behind her, and the story was complete.